All right, all right, all right. Welcome, everybody. Another episode of Legend Sports Amplify. And we're always here once or twice a week talking baseball history and Negro League baseball history, Latin baseball, all those passions and pursuits that go along with it. And I'm really happy to have on today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Negro League legacy author Wayne Moody. How you doing, man?
Not bad, Phil. What about yourself?
Doing okay, doing good, doing good. I appreciate you taking your time. I was really excited when you were coming out with your new book, and when it finally hit, made sure I ran out and got it. It's fantastic. We'll talk a little bit about all that, but I appreciate you taking the time today because there's a lot that I could talk to you probably all day about this stuff. I mean, we were talking before we got started. It's been something that got in my blood a while back, and it is just an amazing subject. And I'm glad that people are continuing to tell the stories, and not just the stories of the superstars of the people who kind of paved the way as well. So you have a deep tie to the Negro Leagues with your grandfather, which we'll talk about in the book. But between then and now, growing up as a kid to today and writing this book, I'm sure there's a lot that goes into your origin story. Tell us a little bit about you.
Um, well, always been a big baseball fan. I got that through my grandfather and my dad. Even at the age of 4, my grandfather always told me about Negro League players. And he also, the thing that he did that I really, years later, really liked, he was always training me, but not letting me know. I was 4 years old. We'd be talking, and he'd have like a little rubber ball, and he'd throw it to the right side, and I'd catch it while he's talking to me. Throw it to the right side, I'd catch it, and he'd throw it to the left side, I'd catch it, all while he's talking to me. And you don't realize until later on that he's training your coordination. He was always looking ahead. The thing about my grandfather is he was profound. He never raised his voice, but when he said something, it was usually profound, and it was something that was like going to lead you to being a better person. Not only about baseball, about life, period, but he really got me into baseball. he had a big reclining chair. And when I was like 4 and 5, I'd sit in that reclining chair with him and we would watch baseball. And he would show me things that I should do in baseball and things to never let get into my game. And he taught me from a young age. And not only was he a great baseball player, he was a great person as far as knowledge, as far as family. He was just, he was an amazing individual.
Hmm.
And if I could be half the man that he was, I knew I would be okay.
That's the kind of stuff that I think is awesome, right? When you have a role model like that, the experiences that he had, what he went through. Yeah, yeah, you try to live up to that. I hear you, man. I hear you. So you actually you played though as well, right? You played in
Yeah, I
college.
played in college and then I played pro in Venezuela till I hurt my shoulder.
Huh,
That's what, yeah, hurt my shoulder, and it was a torn rotator cuff. And back then, the surgery wasn't what it is now.
right?
So they said it was like a 40-60% chance that I'd play again if they did the operation. Or they said I could wait a year and a half, almost 2 years, and it would heal and then try it again. But it got to the point 2 years. I had taken my mother's advice because there were scouts around all the time, scouts that wanted to draft me right out of high school, send me to other locales to play. My mother said, no, you're going to college. So I ended up going to Gannon University and playing ball there. And then it was funny because it was only 2 days after I graduated from Gannon, I got a call. It was like from the New York Met organization and asked me, could I get on a plane and go to Caracas, Venezuela and play some ball down there. So
Hmm.
that's where I ended up getting hurt. But I have no regrets. It's, I love baseball, and I played the game because of a love of baseball that was ingrained in me from my family. So I never felt bad about that.
How did you find your way down to Venezuela?
Um, there there was a scout here in Pittsburgh, and I had gone to a couple tryouts. Elmer Gray, you've heard of Elmer Gray?
No, I have not.
Elmer Gray was one of the best scouts in Major League Baseball. Went to my high school, and we actually both became uh, members of the Hall of Fame in my high school, South Hills High School. But Elmer Gray was a big time scout, also a good friend of my grandfather's. He's the one that got me the tryouts. He's the one that called the Mets and talked to me to the Mets. And that's why the Mets sent me to, they wanted to see if I could really play. That's why they sent me to Caracas. Competition there was stiff, but I did pretty well.
So he was a scout for the Mets?
He was a scout, period.
Period.
But
Okay.
he knew he knew a couple people in the Mets organization, and that's how he hooked me up with them.
Man, that had to be a big step going down to Venezuela, right?
Woo! There was a kid. He was from Biloxi, Mississippi. He was 6'8", about 270 pounds, named Newland Beeson. We called him Newbie. Could throw the ball. Now, back then, he was throwing the ball 100 miles an hour. I was so glad he was on my team, but I had to bat against him in practice, and it was a chore.
Man, oh
It was a
man.
chore. Really good players down there. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, I can't imagine you just to pick up and head to Venezuela.
Right.
How old were you at the time?
At the time, I was 21. Yep.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big step. So your book is called The Real Story of the Negro Leagues. And like we talked about before we got on here, what I enjoyed about it is it's basically a whole bunch of mini biographies on notable players and other figures. You have owners, you have Teenie Harris in there, you have so many others that all played a role in um, kind of, I guess, in a way, paving the way for Jackie. And I know you go in depth onto 50-ish, 50 some players, and then smaller on another whole bunch, over about 100, I think I counted. But what makes it the real story?
Well, it's the real story because a lot of people are confused, just like you just mentioned. Jackie Robinson, a lot of people thought he was the first African American player
Right.
to go into the major leagues, and he wasn't. There were not quite a few, but there were a few that were before him that actually went to the major leagues. For example, the first African American player to play in Major League Baseball was Walter White.
Hmm.
Walter White. Now he only had 4 at bats, but he was the first player to play in the major leagues. What happened? The player for Providence at the time. Providence was a pro team, and their first baseman got hurt. They called him the Orator. He's in the Hall of Fame now, too, the Orator. But he got hurt, broke his finger in practice. Uh, Walter White went to Brown University. He is a star.
Hmm.
He happened to be around, and they brought him in to play for the Orator that day. Went 1 for 4, stole a base, scored a run, but he was the first African American to ever play Major League Baseball.
Cool. There was a Jim Orator Schaefer. I remember. I'm not sure if that's the one, but the nicknames back in those days
Oh yeah,
were
were
classic,
amazing.
right? I mean, they're very literal most of the time when it came. Orator meant he talked a lot, right? I'm sure that's what
Right,
that meant.
right.
Yeah, and there was a lot of deacons, a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
because they were very
Mhm.
pious guys. They were the ones who didn't drink and do whatever back in those days. Yeah,
Right.
baseball back in the beginning started out, I guess it's kind of like as a more of an upper middle class kind of get out in the sun sport, way back
Right.
when. But by the time the 1880s, 1890s, like you talk about that time frame came along, it was pretty rough and tumble. Yeah, yeah, guys were, and the rule changes. I mean, that's the thing. The one thing about it that always just it blows my mind. People pushing back on Negro League statistics being added to the record book. Right?
Right.
They were okay with someone in 1880, Tim Keefe, having the lowest ERA back when there was no mound and it was 50 feet and they were
Right.
pitching underhand and it was 9 balls and 7 strikes and sometimes you can catch it on a bounce and something. I mean, come on, really? And you're
Hmm.
okay with that though, being the lowest ERA of all time. And then what revelation that I hope I keep getting people to realize is all those years until Jackie, before he finally reintegrates the game. How many Negro League players, black baseball, Latin players would have been in Major League Baseball but weren't, meant that there was a lot of players in Major League Baseball and then all the way down through the minor leagues that wouldn't have been there if there was integration.
Right.
And every time I say that, people go, "Oh yeah, yeah, I guess you're right."
Hmm.
So if you're okay with statistics, then I just don't. Yeah, the pushback to me it drives me crazy all the time. So tell us about your grandfather.
Um, well, he started out in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Went to 2 high schools. At first, he went to Kelly Miller High School, and but they wouldn't let him play baseball. Okay, and my grandfather played everything: baseball, football,
Hmm.
basketball, track. So he transferred to Sumner High School, where he set records in all 4 sports. And he got discovered. Um, Judge Tinker, Harold Tinker, great Negro League player and great friend of the family, too. Reverend Tinker, the team from Pittsburgh came down to play this Clarksburg team that my grandfather played for. And my grandfather just went crazy in that game, had 6 hits in the game, drove
Wow.
in like 6 runs. Uh, and Harold Tinker, Reverend Tinker, went back and talked to Cum Posey and said, "Come, you got to see this Willis Moody. You got to get him up here." So Cum Posey was responsible for bringing my grandfather from Clarksburg, West Virginia, to
Wow.
Pittsburgh. Okay, when he got to Pittsburgh, Cum didn't put him on the Grays right away because he was young. He's only 19, so he put him on the Pittsburgh Keystones, where he played with Hap Allen, Dizzy Dismukes. Dizzy Dismukes was actually the manager, pitcher and manager. There were a bunch of stars on the team at that time that probably could have beaten the Grays at that time. But he had a great season or two with the Pittsburgh Keystones, and then Cum Posey brought him over to the Grays. And he actually replaced Composey as the center fielder for the Homestead Grays.
Wow.
And from that point, it just got better and better. I put some statistics on my grandfather. It was all put together through, I've got scrapbooks that are like this thick.
Mm-hmm.
And it had box scores and
Boy, oh
things
boy.
in there. And that's how I was able to put together some of his statistics that Saber and some of the other places didn't
That
have.
stuff, that stuff is like a national treasure stuff. Let me tell
Oh
you.
yeah, yep.
Yeah.
I'm in the process of trying to get them revitalized because some of the articles and things are over 110 years old,
Wow.
and I'm
Wow.
in the process of trying to get them so they don't all fall apart. Now I have them each page in plastic, but I want to be able to revitalize those too.
That the efforts to kind of try to piece together the history and the statistics of teams and players is an ongoing thing, as you know, right? And
Right.
you know, they have groups, seam heads, who has been doing a lot of that work. Other people, and it reaches a point, I think, where you know what, the kind of stuff that you have, someone's going to find anything new that they're going to get becomes much harder because it's just
Right.
hard to pin this stuff down. But like what you have, hopefully there's a whole much more, there's more people out there that have a trunk up in an attic somewhere with all this
Exactly.
stuff that because you need it. You
Bill,
need it
that's
to.
exactly what I wanted to say. Until you come across someone that maybe had a relative that was in the Negro Leagues, and just like you said, up in the attic, they have a trunk,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of the statistics to this day are still sketchy
Mm-hmm.
about the Negro Leagues. So unless you come across someone that has actual information, it's going to remain that way. Luckily, the Pittsburgh Courier was one of the best
Yes.
Negro newspapers in the country. So a lot of the statistics came from them. Luckily, I had the statistics from like 100 years back because they had a fire at
Right.
the they had a fire and a lot of that stuff was burned up. So I feel fortunate that I have some of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's a great point what you just said though. In all these conversations I've been having, trying to point out that yeah, there were colored newspapers, white
Right.
newspapers. Many,
Right.
many times the accounts you wouldn't find anything over here on any of these guys, or very, very little, unless it was a very, very progressive, white newspaper.
Right.
And so the only accounts that you have that were telling these stories. Now, put yourself back 100 years or more ago, and in a time of Jim Crow and the racism at the time and all the pushback. Um, and understand that some of these newspapers, like they had a fire at the Pittsburgh Courier, but there's some of these newspapers, they went out of business. Many of them
Right.
in the Depression. Poof,
Right.
everything that they had is gone and will never be recovered. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's unfortunate. And so I hope there are a lot of more people out there that have some of this laying around somewhere because
Oh yeah.
you
Um,
hope.
a gentleman that passed away, Ted Page, he had a lot of information also. And Ted Page and my grandfather were like that. My grandfather's three best friends, other than Ralph Lefty Mellix, who became family, but other than that, Ted Page, Judy Johnson, and Cyclone were his best friends.
Wow.
Um, and
Joe Williams, you talking about?
Yep, Joe Williams was one of my
Wow.
grandfather's best friends. There's a couple pictures in the book of my grandfather and Smokey Joe on the same team on the Homestead Grays. One of my
Wow.
grandfather's best friends, Smokey Joe. He was another guy. He was kind of quiet. He didn't say a whole lot because that's all my grandfather used to talk about. He said you'd have to prod him to say something. But one of his best friends, Judy Johnson. Judy Johnson and my grandfather and Lefty Mellix at one time played up in Atlantic City for the Bacharachs. And they introduced, at the time, Judy Johnson wasn't getting a lot of playing time. And Lefty Mellix kept telling him, son, you're too good, to be playing here. why don't you see about coming down to Pittsburgh? And eventually he did. He ended up playing for the Crawfords and the Homestead Grays. And, the rest is history. Yeah. But
Amazing.
I mean, there are situations like that people aren't aware of
Hmm.
that would lend more information to the credence of the Negro Leagues.
And that's the thing that, and I mentioned this to you before we started about these stories, why they're important, and why you've got to get them from different viewpoints, different people. You kind of
Mhm.
triangulate things because there is some embellishment. Everybody knows about the stories about Cool Papa Bell was so fast, and all that kind of
Right.
thing. Josh Gibson hit one over the mountain. Of course, there's some of that embellishment, but
Hmm.
in all of those stories, there is that element of trying to describe how great these guys were, and
Right.
that's something that you can't really put a statistical number on some of this. I mean,
Hmm.
that's why these stories are so important. Uh, so your dad, just the fact that Smokey Joe Williams, who may be the greatest Negro League pitcher of all
Exactly.
time, may
Yep.
be. I mean, he may be. Um, Satchel Paige, I'm sure he's in that
Mhm.
same that same vein.
Yeah.
Uh,
Hilton Smith. Yep.
yeah,
They were all great. Yep.
that these guys were best friends with your grandfather is like an amazingly cool thing. I mean, that's
Hmm.
that's just an amazingly cool thing. So, what year does he start with the Grays? 30s,
He
right?
started with the Grays in 1918.
Wow,
That
that
was the
was
first
before,
year.
long before they were a.
Right. Long
Okay,
before they joined the Negro Leagues.
wow.
Yep. That was the first year because no, I'm sorry, 1919. Because the first year when he first came up, like I said, he played with the Pittsburgh Keystones, and I think that was 19 1917. He played with the Pittsburgh Keystones, and then he
Wow.
came over to the Grays. Um, but yeah. Mhm.
Well, you are in. There's a few cities, and a lot of it has to do with the press coverage and the size and what was available after the Great Migration. People, from the South going to the larger cities and so forth. But Pittsburgh, the deep history, not just Negro League history, Black baseball history, but sports history in general. Um, you're in a place where it's all around you. Uh,
Yep.
you know, I think it's just a fantastic place. So you had Pittsburgh, you had Chicago, you had
Kansas City.
Kansas City, Philadelphia was
Mhm.
another place. Obviously, New York. Those
Yep.
those were like kind of the nexuses. But Pittsburgh was kind of that gateway, right, where people
Right.
were. So the how much barnstorming did your grandfather do? Did you guys talk about that at all?
Yeah. He in the scrapbook, I have there's like 2 pages of stamps, where he had sent my
Oh,
grandmother letters from like all over the world, Cuba, Venezuela. He played in Venezuela. Um,
wow.
it was amazing. I guess it's been about
Yeah,
2 or 3 weeks ago. I put on Twitter picture of his chain with the cross.
oh, it's beautiful. I saw that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all the Negro League players that went on boats wore those, because the boats back then, it would take them like forever to get to a destination. And so they were men of God,
Hmm.
most of
Hmm.
them. Some of them weren't, but most of them were men of God. Yep.
Yeah, you get on that boat, you need all the help you can get, right?
All you can get. I have to tell you one story that my grandfather talked about Josh Gibson. They were on their way to Cuba. They were going to go to Cuba. They stopped in Florida to play. It was like a college all-star team. Okay, and Josh was catching that day. Now everyone talks about the home run that Josh hit out of Yankee Stadium and some of the other long home runs. But my grandfather said the longest home run he saw was in a game there. They played in at this stadium, and of course back then the fences were like 400 feet away. Well, they played at this field that the fence in left center was about 420. There was a rail yard in the back of the field, and the rail cars and things were there. And the rail cars were about another 100, feet away from that wall, Josh Gibson hit a ball off of one of those rail cars.
Oh
My
my God.
grandfather always talked about that. He said he saw Josh, and he said the ball was never more than 20 feet off the ground. You
Oh
know,
my goodness
yeah.
gracious.
My grandfather told me that story from the time I was old enough to hear words. You know, that's all he talked about was Josh. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So did he play in Puerto Rico as well, your granddad?
Yeah, he played in Puerto Rico. Yep, he played all over. Um, One day on Twitter, I'll put that page, those couple pages that has the stamps of all the different locales that he played in. I'll
Cool.
throw
Yeah,
that
that'd be
on
great.
Twitter.
That would be awesome to see. Yeah,
Yep.
that'd be very, very cool to see. So, and when did his career wrap up?
Well, it wrapped up because he got a job at U.S. Steel. Composey hooked the job up for him,
Mm-hmm.
and he was making a lot more money than he was barnstorming.
Mm-hmm.
And Cum had it to he worked at U.S. Steel for a while and still played ball, but he was making so much money because he didn't work in the steel mill. He worked in the office. He was the first black man to work in the office at U.S. Steel,
Wow.
and he also coached their team. It was called Carnegie, Illinois, and that was the steel workers team. He coached and played. I mean, he might have been in his early 50s, and he was still playing. But then he realized that he was making more money at U.S. Steel. He wanted to spend more time with my grandmother, and that's when his career wrapped up.
Interesting. Yeah, the industrial league teams and the mill teams, those were
Oh, they were
important.
unreal.
Yeah, a lot of those were probably good enough to play in any league. Some of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Birmingham.
Josh Gibson played for one of those teams, and he also, when he first came to Pittsburgh, he played for Gimbel's Department Store.
I saw that famous picture of that, right? Isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was only 17.
No,
Yeah,
17.
he was only
Oh my
17.
God.
And they said he hit a ball that was about 450 feet. And they thought he was like 25, 26 years old, but he was only 17, might have been 17 or 18 at the time. So
Unbelievable.
he was a natural, and Josh could play everything.
Hmm.
And the thing that a lot of people didn't know, they think home run hitter, oh, big guy. He was a big guy, but Josh could run.
Hmm. I'm
Josh
sure.
could really run.
You know, most of these guys were such good all-around athletes. Like you
Oh
mentioned with
yeah,
your grandfather, even could play any sport. But baseball was the only sport where you can actually make a little bit of money doing it. Unfortunately, at
exactly.
the time, so that's why a lot of them wound up playing baseball. Because the Composey story to me is pretty amazing, right? I mean, because
Yep,
there's the basketball connection
right.
there in Pittsburgh as well as the baseball connection. I mean, he had that's an incredible story that in Pittsburgh in general, like I said.
Oh
So
yeah. Well, he's the only one in history to be in both Hall of Fames,
yeah,
basketball and baseball. Yeah.
that's right. So you've got him in your book. Like I mentioned, there's a little over 50, I think, that you do little longer biographies on, and then a whole bunch that you do smaller ones.
Hmm.
But
Well,
what made you
go ahead.
pick?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what made you select the players that you picked?
Well, mostly because they were players that my grandfather talked about. So it took me 20 to 30 years to put this all together
I bet.
because I researched everything my grandfather told me, and almost 100% of it was correct. So for example, George Stovey, very few people ever heard of George Stovey, one of the greatest pitchers in history.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't want to give too much information on it because there's a nice story on him in the book,
Hmm.
but he was one of the greatest pitchers ever that no one ever heard of.
Hmm.
Um, it was just something. I call it a labor of love,
Absolutely.
and it made me research some of these players. There were players who have zero recognition in
Exactly.
Negro League files. Um, there was a gentleman that used to come over to the house all the time, and they had a Friday night poker game. His name was Willie Irby. Willie Irby. There's nothing on him in the annals of Negro League baseball. My grandfather said he's one of the fastest guys to ever play. You know, he said he was in that cool Papa Bell, Sam Jethro type of a player. And I never knew it. You know, they'd come over to the house, they'd play poker, they're laughing, joking, smoking cigars, you know, and sitting around that table was greatness that I didn't even realize. You know?
Absolutely, right? I love that picture you got in the book of was it Ted Page's bowling alley?
Right, right.
Is that in Pittsburgh? Was that in Pittsburgh?
That's in Pittsburgh. Yep.
No kidding.
Ted Page, Judy Johnson's in the picture. Vic Harris is in the picture.
Well, that's why
Both my grandfathers, Ralph Mellix and Willis Moody, and Clarence Bruce. Clarence Bruce was one of the final big time stars in the Negro Leagues
that nobody's heard of.
That nobody's heard of.
Right.
His son is my best friend, Kirk Bruce. I got to tell you a little bit about Kirk Bruce and Jennifer Bruce.
Mm-hmm.
Their jerseys hang in the annals of Pitt's. I always want to call it Pitt Fieldhouse, but it's the new facility.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer Bruce is the leading scorer in history at Pitt in basketball, both men and women. And then mm-hmm. Kirk averaged 18 points a game. But Kirk and I grew up together, and I always thought him and I were going to play pro ball together because we started when we were like 7 or 8. We started playing Little League when we were 9. You know, we were playing against kids that were, 11, 12 years old, but we were holding our own. But I knew that Kirk was going to play basketball. There was a YMCA, the Knoxville YMCA, that we used to go to. And you would go, they had a bowling alley, a pool, and a gym. And first you went and we would hoop in the gym. Then you would go swimming, and then you would finish up in the bowling alley. So one day we had just finished hooping. I'm like, come on, Kirk, let's go swimming. And Kirk said, oh, you know what? I'll be down. I just want to shoot a few more jumpers. So I went down and went swimming, Then I bowled. I came back up in the gym, and Kirk was still up there shooting that smooth jumper. I knew then it was going to be basketball.
Mm-hmm. That's the dedication it takes, right?
Oh yeah, and his dad worked for the post office, and the Little League field was on the way home. He would get off the bus right there at McKinley Park Field and watch us play, still with his uniform on, everything, and watch us play. And he would give us information. You're doing this, you're doing that. Mm-hmm. It's one of the few people that my grandfather and dad said, okay, you listen to him.
When you started this whole conversation we're having out with that story about your grandfather, even at such a young age, they're teaching you constantly.
Right.
I mean, you may not even realize it, and they might not even realize it.
Right.
But that's kind of how most parents should try to be. I mean, every single minute of every single day with your kids is kind of a teachable moment, right? And right. So, that was a great story about growing up, and there he is, right, left hand, right hand.
I'm going to tell you a little bit more that's in the book about my grandfather, but my grandfather I guess I was like 8. And he would play what was called over the wires with me, the telephone wires, right? He would throw a ball over the telephone wires and have me turn my back, run to a spot, and turn around and catch the ball. Now, when he first started doing that, it was a rubber ball. Ball was bouncing off my head and things, but I finally mastered that. Mm-hmm. And then when I went to my first Little League practice and I was doing that, people were like, oh, what? Wow, look at him.
Look at him,
This is like over the wires, Uh-huh. So he, like you said, he was always teaching, but he didn't let you know he was teaching. He just wanted you to have a good time, but at the same time, he was teaching you how to play the game correctly.
That's right. So besides your grandfather, who's your favorite character out of the Negro Leagues Black Baseball? Do you have a favorite?
Yes, I mean, everybody loves Josh and Satchel Paige, but Sam Jethro is my favorite because he was like one of my mentors. When I went to Gannon, which is in Erie, he had a restaurant nightclub in Erie called the Steakhouse. And one of my first games, this is in the book also, one of my first games, right? We had just come back from a Southern tour. Okay. Freshman year, I had a bang up Southern tour. I'm full of myself, right?
Hmm.
Our first game, a regular game of the year, was against Clarion University, and they had Pete Vukovich.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
That's a good
First
ball.
game
That's a
of the
good ball
year up
player
in
right there.
Erie.
Yeah.
Oh, up in Erie, it's like 40 degrees. He's blazing the ball in there 96, 97 miles an hour. He no hits us. But my final at bat, right? He beat us 1-0. We had a good pitcher too that played in the major leagues. Josh Greeley's dad pitched for us at Gannett.
Wow.
And they beat us 1-0. But final at bat, I was the last man up. I'm like, you know what? I'm sitting dead red fastball. I'm going to drive one, right? And I got it. And I drove it to left center field. And right at the fence, the center fielder caught the ball. Boom. That was the no hitter.
Wow.
Well, Sam Jethro was sitting in the stands. I didn't know who he was. I just saw this older, dapper, black man sitting there in the stands, right? So on my way out, after I'd taken off my spikes and put my glove in my bag and I'm walking past, he's sitting there and said, if you'd have turned that top hand over, that ball would have been out on the street, right? And I'm like, you know what? I've just been no-hitted. I don't want this old guy telling me what to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I walk away from him, right? And I go back and get my hat because I left my hat on the bench. I said, you know what? I'm going to give this guy a piece of my mind. I'm young,
Mm-hmm.
I walk back by. He's gone, right? So I'm looking around. Okay. So the next game, we played Youngstown State. Again, he's sitting in the stands, right? So he told me, son, turn that top hand over when you get a good fastball. You'll drive it 30 feet further. I'm like, all right, man. So not the first at bat, but the second at bat, I get a fastball and I drive it out on the street for a home run. I went over to thank him after the game, and he said, "Oh, you thought I was just some old fool." My
Some old
grandfather,
fool.
yeah, he said, your grandfather told me to keep tabs on you. So I'm like, well, what's your name? He said, my name's Sam Jethro. He said,
Oh
look me up.
no! Look me
So
up.
the
That's
first
right.
thing I did was call my grandfather, and it said, oh yeah, he said that's Sam Jethro, but he likes to be called the Jet.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. He was
so
only
I
a
went
rookie of
to
the
the
year
library
and
immediately, looked him up, and found out
mm-hmm.
this guy was a superstar. You
Superstar.
know,
Yeah.
and we were friends until the day he died. Not, biggest mentor outside of my family.
Awesome. And there's a great example of all these things we're kind of talking about. He was what, 32 when he
Right, he
finally
was the
got a
oldest
shot?
rookie of the year. Yeah,
And even when Jackie broke the, reintegrated, baseball again, there were still slow. Some teams were very slow.
right,
They had quotas. How many color African or Latin
right,
players could they have? Those kinds of things, right? And so many of these guys, he's one of many who should have. I mean, Ray Dandridge, that story to me
woo,
always just drives me nuts when you think of the fact he was sitting in Minneapolis having to play at AAA because,
right,
can't have that many black guys up there on the
right.
Giants.
Batting 366.
Right. I mean, it's too bad, right? So every time I hear all these comparison stories and
Right,
equivalencies, I'm thinking, wait a minute, wait. If this was a normal world back then, these kids would have been identified when they were still in high school.
right,
They would have had the mentoring, and not that they didn't have it. They had it, like you're pointing out, but they would have been in that pipeline to play in the major leagues. Like, look at Jackie, right? He was 27.
right,
What if he starts when he's 2021, like most
right,
guys do, right? I mean, how much different of a career and what kind of he was a superstar anyway.
right,
What would he have been like if he had had a normal career arc like these guys have?
right. Same thing with Satchel Paige. Imagine Satchel Paige pitching in the major leagues when he's like 2021.
Right, not when he's 45. I mean,
Right.
it's
Joe
crazy.
DiMaggio said he's the best pitcher he ever faced.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I know in your book, I don't want to steal too much of that thunder, but I do want to hear this story from you. You mentioned that besides grandfather, you had Lefty Mellix, who has a special place with you. But
Right.
there's something in that book that blew me away because the movie to me is kind of bittersweet.
Right.
Bingo long, right? Because it paints this kind of, I mean, it shows some of the things that were going on, but
Right.
it kind of maybe paints it in too frivolous a light, maybe in some cases. But
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but the character. Tell us about the character connection between Lefty Mellix and that movie.
Well, in that movie, Richard Pryor played Lefty Mellix, and he was the one that was like speaking like gibberish that
Hmm.
was supposed to be Spanish, but it was really gibberish.
Hmm.
Lefty Mellix used to do that all the time, and they talked to Lefty Mellix about it, and he gave him the okay to put it in the movie. But
Awesome.
also in that movie, what's the gentleman's name? Uh,
Which part?
the catcher.
James Earl Jones.
James Earl Jones was
Hmm.
supposed to be Josh Gibson in that movie.
Yeah,
Yep.
more or less. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was uh, what would you call it?
you know,
Editorial license, we'll
yeah.
call
I
it.
mean, I love the movie. It's fun. I mean, there's a lot of great comedians and actors in that movie. Um, but yeah, I guess it kind of paints a little different light. But they do try to put some of the historical
Right.
elements in there. The talking gibberish. I mean, that goes back to the 1880s,
Exactly.
1890s, right? I mean, there is a
Right.
historical precedent for that.
Hmm.
Because these guys that's where the Cuban Giants come from and the Cuban X
Exactly.
Giants and all those. So yeah, there was a reason for it. I don't know if that's what they intended. Maybe I'm not real familiar on the background of the writing of that movie, but I knew that connection. I thought, oh yeah, okay, cool. I'm glad they put that in there because then he tried to pass himself off again. The Native American. Remember, he was trying to be
Exactly.
just like Charlie Grant, who you have in your
Charlie
book as
Grant,
well, right?
Oklahoma.
Yeah, so many of those guys that they tried to do those things with. Um, John Donaldson, they say there's another story about John Donaldson. The same thing. They told him go to Cuba and come back as a Cuban,
Right.
right? So yeah,
Yeah, he should be in the Hall of Fame.
he should be. Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's one of there where there's so much statistics on him after, but he's already in his 30s by the
Right.
time the Negro National League. That there's a lot of weight being put on those as if somehow that was his whole career, but
Hmm.
he had a lot of mileage on him by the time he hit the Negro National League.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so what are you working on next? What do you got going on? I love the stuff you put out every day. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's great that to put out these little tidbits on players on the history of the game. I think it's great. You working on anything now?
Well, I'm kind of working on a play
Oh,
about my grandfather and the Negro Leagues and basically about his life. And I'm kind of working on that because a friend of mine, Rita Gregory, she's a playwright around here, and she said, Wayne, you should write something about your grandfather. And I've been working a little bit on that, uh, but
boy.
basically I've been trying to promote my book for right now.
Hmm.
But that's probably going to be my next step.
That'd be cool. That was to me an amazing thing that there was a Josh Gibson opera
Right,
that to me is just like what I had on an author. Must have been towards the end of the summer last year, maybe September, August. Jonah Winter, who
hmm,
that's his friend. He writes children's books. He's written a lot of books on black baseball history, the Negro Leagues, and others. He's uh, going back to the 80s and 90s. He's been writing them a long time, but illustrated children's books, right?
right,
But that's the hard thing. But anyway, his best friend is the one, or one of his good friends is the one who wrote the opera,
right.
the Josh Gibson opera, which is kind of cool, to have that tie. But one of the things too that like what we're talking about, there are so many stories and so many things you want to highlight. Where do you start, right? I mean,
Yeah,
how do you narrow it down and focus on it? Because I don't know. I'm probably like you. I want to tell them all. I mean, I want
Yep.
them. I want to have them all out there. I think it would be amazing, but you don't want to overwhelm people with sensory overload on some of this stuff either, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that they're putting Bud Fowler, Minnie Minoso, and of course Buck
Mm-hmm.
in the Hall of Fame. Buck should have been in the Hall of Fame. Minnie Minoso too. Minnie Minoso was a tremendous player. I mean, just absolutely tremendous. And then
Boy.
Bud Fowler, you know, people don't know it. He's the one that started it all, as far as black men getting paid to play on white teams.
Mm-hmm.
He started it all. So it's and he was a tremendous player, absolutely tremendous player. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and I really felt the story that I wrote about him
Mm-hmm.
because it showed what he had to go through to get there, uh,
Yeah.
and it's so important, you know, to see the struggles that these players went through to play the game that they love, and it worked out for some. Some it didn't work out for, but they really enjoyed the game.
Absolutely. And that piece of it and the persistence that it took to keep on going with all the pushback and all the levers of everything, kind of not in your favor. I'll tell you what, that's a great American story if you ask me,
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. So what? I guess I could talk to you all day about this stuff. What it just came to my mind. Pittsburgh, the play about Josh Gibson. It's like that game, the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Have you heard that?
Oh
Right?
yeah,
Where
yeah,
everybody, it just seems like everybody everywhere. If you really sat down and looked, you probably have a 6 degrees to the Negro Leagues connection there.
oh
But
yeah,
but that opera wasn't Udi Napier's grandson.
yep,
He performed in it, right?
yep.
I mean, my God, think of how cool that is. Here's a
Mm-hmm.
he was a teammate and then took Josh's place, right? After Josh passed away.
Right.
And here's his grandson now singing in the opera about Josh Gibson. I mean, you can't. I mean, it's just to me uh, another one of those very, very cool ties and very, very cool stories that's out there that most people don't know a thing
Oh,
about.
exactly. Yeah,
Did
yeah.
you?
Judy Napier played with my best friend's father, Clarence Bruce. And Judy Napier, Clarence Bruce, Luke Easter. They were all on that 1948 championship team,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No.
and they played against the Birmingham Black Barons. Birmingham Black Barons had a 17-year-old player. You might be familiar with him. His name's Willie Mays.
Willie
Yep.
Mays, yeah, boy, oh boy. And in this digging, like I said, every day I try to do a little bit of digging. You talked about the industrial leagues and those um, factory leagues that people played in. When I was digging for some things on the Birmingham Industrial League, to find out that Willie Mays' father, Cat Mays,
Right.
played and was a heck of a ball player
Yep.
but because of whatever circumstances because I think people forget these guys were human beings, right? They're trying to make
Yep.
money, they're trying to make a living, they're trying to do what they have to do. Boy, oh boy, I mean, like you went to Venezuela, you know what that's like.
Yep.
These guys were traveling all over the continent, spreading
Right.
the game of baseball all over the place. Man, I'll tell you what, it's just like you got to give these hats off to all these guys that accomplished what they accomplished.
Yep.
Yeah, especially
I
under the
mean,
conditions.
it was amazing what some of the players accomplished.
Hmm.
For example, Luke Easter. You know,
Right?
he was cut by the Kansas City Monarchs and a couple other teams, and finally got on with a team in Cincinnati, I believe it was, that was owned by Abe Saperstein, that owned the Harlem Globetrotters, and it finally gave him his shot. And
And
from there, of course, he went to the Cleveland Indians, where he was a star.
and another guy who's in his 30s when that all happened finally.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing thing. I mean, yeah, the Sam Jethro story. He should have been up and playing in
Oh,
Major League Baseball long before that,
oh yeah.
but did not get the opportunity. Did Did your grandfather ever talk about? I mean, so integration talk, there was a little bit of it prior. There was always was that little bit of talk. There was always that push. Was there any? I mean, did he talk? What was his thoughts on all that?
Well, my grandfather always said we were as good as they were.
Yeah.
That's what he always said. Uh, and he always talked about Bill Vett. He said if it was up to Bill Vett, all these boys would have been in the major leagues. That was the feeling of most of the players.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Bruce, Clarence Bruce, he said the same thing. He said, we can play as well as they can. We're just not getting the chance.
Yeah, and
And so that's
for one simple reason, the
right.
racism at
But
the
you know
time. Yeah.
what? My grandfather was never bitter about it, and Mr. Bruce was never bitter about it. They just came out and said, "Hey, we can play as well as they can. If we'd have had a shot, we'd have been stars too." Yep.
That's right. Yeah, no, there's no doubt, and it's no surprise that the teams that embraced that coming
Right.
in the late 40s, early 50s are the teams who excelled, right?
Exactly.
Or did better, and then the teams who didn't struggled for a long time
A
through the
long
50s and
time.
60s. I mean, the Yankees were good through the 50s because they still had all that talent built up, but
Right.
things were changing. Things were
Right.
changing. You know, the things like the Rule 5 draft was changed, and the amateur draft comes along in the 60s, expansion, all kinds of things that by the time now you're trying to play catch up. I mean, yes, Elston Howard comes along, but they
Right.
were slow. So were the Red
Hmm.
Sox, the same thing. And so it's no
Yeah. I mean, Pumpsy Green, Boston, they were the last team to integrate.
right years after everybody else. So
Mhm.
no surprise the Giants and the Pirates and the Indians, even the Braves had their due. You know, Milwaukee
Right.
or Boston Braves they were at the time. No surprise that the Dodgers and all those teams, and look at all the guys who came out. Anybody who thinks that the talent wasn't there when these guys come out of the Negro Leagues and they are the majority of rookies of the year, Cy Young
Right.
Award winners, MVPs, All Stars for the next decade. Yeah, come on.
Yeah.
No surprise. So Pittsburgh, you're a big Pittsburgh sports fan as well. I know you have your
Oh
opinions
yeah.
on all your. You stick with baseball? No, you tweet a lot about the Steelers.
Oh yeah. Plus, I'm a basketball official too. Yeah. So
You're a
I
basketball official? Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
I love all sports. I like hockey. I don't like hockey on TV, but if you ever go to a game,
Yeah. It's a lot of
it's
fun.
like really quick. And I like it. I like all sports. I like all sports that are played well.
Hmm.
See, that's the problem with the Pittsburgh Pirates right now.
Yeah, yeah.
They don't play very well. Um, I don't really want to get into a lot about that, but
Right.
they nowadays you have to pay players if you're going to compete, and right now they're just not doing it.
Well, my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, went to Pitt. So me having gone to Penn State, and my sister's older than I, so I had to put up with all those years of the Pitt Penn State rivalry. Of course,
Right,
this was back. We're talking early '80s when Pitt had Dan Marino, and
right.
you know that rivalry was brutal. I mean, there were some
Mm-hmm.
games, boy, that was so much fun. I've only went to Pittsburgh one time to a game, and Penn State lost one away game. But it seems like every time I'd see Pitt play Penn State, Pitt would win, even when I was going to school there, you know. But yeah, the Pittsburgh sports, yeah, it's something like for me. Like I said, I'm down here in Houston. I'm going to always be a Pennsylvania. Of course, I'm a more Eastern Philly guy, but
Yeah,
yeah. So uh, basketball, the 76ers, that shot last night by Embiid was incredible. Did you see the replay of
right.
that? Oh my
Yep.
goodness. So, Wayne, this was a lot of fun. I appreciate your time. Again, your book, The Real Story of the Negro Leagues, has just been out. Where can we find it?
You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Apple. Um, those are
I
the
got the
three main.
Kindle.
There are some smaller.
I got the Kindle version. because
Right.
I
Yeah.
like
You
to
can get the Kindle version. Yep.
excuse me, because I like I like to be able to read it on my phone. I like to read these things on my
Exactly.
phone
Yep.
when I get times to. Now you have a website out there as well that you bump around on too, right?
Right. Yep. It's Erica ERICA dot Erica52.com.
Yeah, because you've got a lot of great photos of your grandfather, the homestead grays. You post a little bit of Negro League history. You got your own little blog going. So
Okay,
yeah,
that
people
one
check it out.
that's another because I have two websites.
Okay.
That one is Marybelle MARYBELLE dot Marybelle52.com.
And what's the difference in the two of them?
Well, the Marybelle52.com is just stories about the Negro Leagues.
Gotcha. Okay. That's the
Uh,
one. That's the one I've been on a
right,
number
right.
of times. Yeah.
Yep.
And
And
what do you got
the
on the other
other
one?
one, it just says some of the other things I'm writing. It's more or less my writer's website, um, but it's also good too. It just tells some of the things that I'm working on. And yep,
Cool.
but Marybelle52.com is the one about the Negro Leagues.
Awesome. Well, Wayne, this was a lot of fun. I appreciate it. Best of luck on your book. Keep on doing what you're doing. I would love to see some more of the things that we talked about. The stamps would be very
Oh
cool.
yeah,
That would be very cool to see the things that your grandfather collected over the years. Because, like I said, that stuff is national treasure. It really is.
oh yeah,
And
yeah.
you got to make sure preserve it. Get that stuff scanned. Get it all.
Yep. That's
Yeah.
my next. Yep. Yeah, that's my next thing. I'm gonna have it all scanned in, so that even if something would happen to it,
Hmm.
yep. Because
Yeah.
I'm gonna pass it down to my daughters, and then have them pass it down to their children. So
No,
yep.
it's a great legacy, and people need to keep these stories alive and keep on telling them. And I hope you write 10 more books on everything that you're able to find out. So thank you again. I appreciate your time. This was a lot of fun, and you stay well. Be careful.
All right, you too. I enjoyed it.
All right. Bye bye, man.
Okay, bye bye.